Okay, here we are in our agricultural unit talking about some of the concepts related to growing food on an industrial scale and on an organic, more locally grown scale. So what we're going to talk about today for a few minutes is irrigation techniques, both large and small. And large, we'll be talking about two techniques that are used industrially, and small, more, like I said, locally or organically. So here we go. To start off here, we're going to start off on more of an industrial scale. So we're going to do center pivot irrigation. And we'll just draw a quick note, and then I'll show you some pictures. You might have even seen this type of irrigation occurring in the Midwest or in the West. As you fly across the country in a plane and you look outside the windows, you might see these things. So what we're going to do is draw a big giant square. Okay, and then inside that square is a circle. Alright, now this is what a plot of land that is practicing center pivot irrigation might look like. So right in the middle of this circle is the water well. So every time you see one of these big giant circles, in the middle is the well. So there's a hole drilled. It could be 100 feet down, it could be 500 feet down. However deep the water table is going to dictate how deep your well is. But everywhere you see one of these circular farmed areas, there's a well directly in the center of it. And typically what happens is there's an arm that comes off of that well, and that arm is actually the delivery for the water. So that arm is going to have a little spray, little holes here that's going to spray the water. And then there's wheels that are connected to this thing, and what it's going to do is it's going to slowly rotate over time across this field, and all the while it's rotating, it's sprinkling water down onto the plants. Okay, so this is center pivot irrigation. So there's literally a center pivot, and then this arm pivots around the center. It's pretty self-explanatory. So there you go. So that arm that sprays water, it might take up to 2 or 3 days to rotate once. However, it's constantly moving. The well is your water source. And this is one of the more effective ways to irrigate large plots of land that you're farming. So now there's a couple of problems here with this. The way it's done through center pivot, you have these areas in the corner here that are not farmed. Okay, so you're not using 100% of the land space. However, you are maximizing the amount of land that you're farming, and you might keep materials over here in this not farmed area. It might be there to help any runoff. It'll catch runoff, so it acts as somewhat of a buffer. Nevertheless, this type of irrigation, I'm going to put some cons here. The pros are very simple ones. It works. All right, you're maximizing the amount of land. You're using a groundwater source of water. So you're not taking from rivers or streams. You're not depleting those types of sources. As long as there's groundwater and that continues to be replenished, this is an okay way to access water. The problem here is that it's unsustainable. The more irrigation there is, you are going to draw down the groundwater table. You are going to use that resource, and the more wells you're drilling, and the more wells your neighbor is drilling, and the more wells the entire region is drilling, that's going to deplete the groundwater table. So you have to be careful with that. It sprays water. Now, whenever you spray water, you're going to lose some of it to the air. So some of that water goes into the air and evaporates. Some of it hits the leaves and the soil, and it doesn't hit the roots where the water is supposed to go. So you're losing a little bit of water in this way. And there's energy used in the form of things like pumps, the motor that drives the center pivot. Nevertheless, this is pretty easy to understand. This is center pivot irrigation. So let's look at some pictures. Alright, here is center pivot irrigation. You can see the water being lost to the air here as it evaporates into the air. But you can also see the amount of land that is being farmed in this one plot here. It is a really great way to deliver water to a huge amount of land and a lot of crops all at once. Okay, so here is a little bit of a close-up. So this is what those things are that you've seen before. All right, and I'm bringing up the example of center pivot. You can have these things on a rectangular field, and instead of a center pivot, it just goes back and forth across the land on a square or rectangular area rather than a circle. It doesn't have to be a circle, but that's the most popular in the Midwest. Here you go. This is a picture out of a window of a plane. Okay, the second type of industrial irrigation is called gravity-fed irrigation. Okay, and this is going to use gravity to feed irrigation. Okay, so the water source in this case is a river. And what we're going to do is we're going to very simply use a little pump house, and we're going to draw water in through the pump house and out into what we call a main line, and then that main line is going to feed the crop rows. Here's our main line. Let me just fix something here. There we go. We don't need that. And it's going to feed what we call the main line. So now if these are our crop rows, let's say this is the plowed field here. All right, this is the crop row. And in between the crop rows are where the plants are growing, because you want to grow your plants on a little bit higher of a level than the rows, so that the water flows down the rows and doesn't flood your plant. All right, if you remember when we went to the farm with Andrew Frankenfield, he grew his plants up on top of little berms or hills. So the idea here is you're going to pump water through this main line, and on the main line are holes drilled that is going to allow the water to flow out and flood the crop rows. So here we go, the water comes down the main line. Let's label that. All right, and the water is going to flood out into the crop row. Now, what usually happens is you flood the top of the crop row so that water makes it all the way down to the bottom, and then the water seeps into the ground and into the root systems of the plants, and that's how the plants get the water. Okay, now this is good because you're effectively delivering water to the plants. All right. However, there's a bunch of cons with this way of doing this type of irrigation. Even though 60% of irrigated lands still use this method, the problem is we're using river water, and that could quickly deplete a source of water for people or for anybody downstream. You could over-irrigate the land, especially at the top of the crop row. And what that's going to lead to is something called salinization. And the salinization is after you've flooded that crop row and the water seeps into the ground or evaporates, the minerals that are in the water are left behind. And the problem is that if those minerals left behind are in big concentrations, salinization is the result. You've poisoned your soil with minerals, and that could literally destroy the soil quality. So it's like a mineral residue left behind, and that's detrimental to the soil quality. This is a less desirable way to irrigate the land because you are using tremendous amounts of water here from a river source. Center pivot is probably the better option, and we are moving in that direction. However, this is still widely used. So let's take a look at some pictures of what this might look like. All right, and here you go. So there's some lines flooding the crop row. Now, you're using a lot of water. What you want to do is deliver the water to the roots. Well, here we're flooding the entire crop row so that the roots that reach the crop row are getting the water. And here's a field where there's some salinization occurring. As that water was dried up or evaporated, the minerals are left behind, and now this area is not going to be fit for farming, and that could be a big problem. Okay, so on a more local scale, what we want to do is look at sustainable approaches to irrigation. What you're going to want to do is get it as close to your house as possible. We're going to try and capture rainwater. That's going to be the first thing. So we're going to hook your gutter up to a series of pipes that are going to feed what we call a rain barrel. And you've all seen rain barrels over at the Save House. Okay, so when it rains, the water is going to hit your roof, okay, run down into your gutters, down into the downspout, and fill up your rain barrel. Now what you want to do is you want to seal the top of it so that mosquito larvae don't grow in there. You can have a real big mosquito problem. I've seen that, and it's pretty it could be pretty nasty. So you're going to want to seal the top of your rain barrel and just hook the pipe into a little hole there at the top. And always have an overflow just in case, and make sure that overflow is pointed away from your house so that the foundation of your home isn't inundated with water and you can have a leak inside your basement or something like that. But this is going to be very simple. All we're going to do is hook our spigot. We're going to have a spigot at the bottom that you can turn on and off when you have to, so you can control the amount of water coming out. And that spigot has a hose attached to it. And just like in gravity-fed irrigation, we're going to have a series of pipes that come out off of our main line. And this is pretty much gravity-fed irrigation. It's just in a smaller, more sustainable way. All right, we're going to put an end cap at the back end here. Okay, so now, just like in gravity-fed, here's our main line. And here are drip lines. And on each drip line are the holes. All right, and typically what you're going to do is you're going to line those holes up right where your plants are. And the best part about this is on each drip line you can put a little valve, so that if you're in control of the amount of water, where and when that water is delivered. So let's say you have a crop like tomatoes that like to be soaked and then dry out, but you have beans who like to be a little bit more wet. So you can open up one valve and close another, controlling the amount of water that goes out. Plus, where you planted the plants at these holes, you're delivering water right to the roots. You're not flooding a crop row. You're not wasting any water. None of it's going into the air at all. You're using water responsibly and sustainably by using rainwater directly to the plant roots, controlling the amount of water you're using. So this is called drip irrigation. Okay, and that's somewhat of a no-brainer if you have your own garden. You can do this with a hose. You don't need a rain barrel or anything like that. This is just a way to use water sustainably. Okay, so there you go. That's a little bit about drip irrigation on a home garden scale. Let's take a look at some of these pictures here. All right, here you go. That's pretty much what we just drew. A small little system growing 3 crops. Those crops go together well, particularly tomatoes and basil, with their drip lines wrapped around the root system. All right, this is what it might look like. You can even have little sprinkler systems as shown here. It doesn't have to be in a garden. It can be in a flower bed. This is a bit of a more sophisticated system. This might have things like chemical injection tanks and equipment to deliver fertilizers, things like that. But it's all geared to using water sustainably, delivering water directly to the roots, and having control over the amount of water that you are using. You see all the valves here on this system. And then here's a little bit on a more larger scale, and they actually have the sprayers here in the background. But this is pretty simple, just a main line and some drip lines. Just go to it. This is more of a commercial scale now, getting away from the small home garden. Looks like they're growing mums here for maybe the fall. Alright, so there you go. Hopefully now you're excited to get out and get yourself dirty in your own gardens, installing some drip irrigation systems, but you also understand irrigation on a large scale, the pros and cons of using center pivot irrigation and gravity fed irrigation on a large scale. So if you have any questions, you know what to do.